Hollis Brackett laughed so loudly the ruined cabin seemed ready to collapse with him. $3 rested in Zebulon Zeb Rourke's hand. "A man gives up a railroad career to care for his grandfather," Hollis said, "and all he ends up owning is a cabin that's already losing to winter." Zeb closed his hand around the coins. He never answered. No one standing there understood why Ephraim Rourke had insisted those $3 must be paid before sunset. No one questioned why the old man refused to give the cabin away. Before winter ended, every person in Black Alder Basin would wish they had asked that question first. 3 days earlier, cold rain tapped against the windows of attorney Amos Bellwether's dark timber office in Cinder Creek. Zeb sat quietly, graveyard mud still drying across his boots. Amos Bellwether broke the seal without ceremony. The room fell still except for the rain. 3 years earlier, Zeb had been a survey assistant laying grades for the Northern Railroad. He left that work the week Ephraim Rourke suffered a stroke that weakened his left side. From then on, each morning began the same way. Zeb helped his grandfather into his coat, split firewood before daylight, studied weathered land books at the kitchen table, and drove the old sled to Alder Spring whenever the snow allowed. The basin became his world. Cordelia Brackett, Ephraim's only daughter, sent just 2 letters during those 3 winters. Her son, Hollis Brackett, never returned until the doctor admitted Ephraim was unlikely to survive another season. Even then, he arrived carrying a preliminary map prepared for Black Fir Timber Syndicate. Zeb never expected the entire ranch. Ephraim had once whispered through a fever, "A man who cares for the land never has to ask the land to remember his name." The memory faded. Back inside the office, Cordelia settled her expensive fur coat. Hollis unrolled his map. Zeb quietly reached for 2 tin cups by habit, paused, then returned one to the shelf beside the empty chair. Amos continued reading with the same steady voice. Cordelia Brackett inherited the Black Alder ranch house, the registered cattle, the hay barns, the horse stables, every freight contract, every wagon, every tool, and every obligation attached to the operation. She finally exhaled. Hollis unfolded his survey map, already tracing a future timber road across the basin. Then Amos turned the page. Ephraim had left Zeb no gift. He offered a transaction. Zeb could leave with his personal tools, his old mule, and the unpaid wages for caring for Ephraim, or he could purchase Alder Watch Cabin and the surrounding 2.3 acres for exactly $3, provided the sale was completed before sunset. The abandoned cabin had once guarded Alder Spring and stored surveying records. Hollis laughed. "That roof won't survive the first heavy snow." Amos slid a small envelope across the desk. Inside rested 3 old silver dollars. "They are not payment," Amos said quietly. "Your grandfather insisted you must use your own." Zeb reached into his pocket. After paying for the funeral, grain for his mule, and a few supplies, only 11 silver dollars remained. $3 sounded insignificant. For him, they were not. Cordelia urged him to take the unpaid wages instead. She admitted she had no desire to watch him freeze inside a collapsing cabin, while the town blamed the family for letting him stay there. Hollis smiled and offered another solution. Sign away the cabin, join the timber-hauling crew, and earn steady money before winter. Zeb answered neither proposal. A memory returned instead. Years earlier, Ephraim had stopped the sled beside Alder Watch Cabin, studied the frost across its roof, and quietly asked, "The coldest place isn't always the first place to freeze." Zeb placed 1 silver dollar onto Amos's desk, then the second, then the third. The attorney recorded the transaction, pressed the official seal into the deed, and handed over 4 things. The deed to 2.3 acres, the cabin key, Ephraim's old wooden survey rod, and a brief boundary description marked by 3 stone monuments. Zeb's thumb paused over the worn pencil marks carved into the rod. He never let it leave his hand. Zeb reached Alder Watch Cabin before sunset. The small structure rested beneath the northern hillside, nearly half a mile from the ranch house. Built in 1859, it stood on basalt footings beneath hand-hewn lodgepole logs. 1/3 of the northern roof had collapsed. Sod roofing had been torn apart by roots. The stone chimney was cracked at its throat. The front door had warped, leaving nearly an inch for wind to enter. 2 floor beams near the pantry were black with rot. The drainage trench behind the cabin had been choked by muck and willow roots. The ground behind the wall now stood higher than the threshold, ready to push snowmelt inside. A dry wooden trough ran from the rocky slope. Zeb settled his old mule, Moss, beneath a leaning shelter. Inside he spread one blanket across the driest corner and lit a careful fire. That first night, wind slipped through every crack. Fine snow drifted through the broken roof silently. Morning came cold. Zeb ignored the broken roof first. Instead, he walked the entire cabin, reading the slope before lifting a single board. Using Ephraim's survey rod, a plumb line, and a straight pole, he found the rear channel had built up almost 4 inches above the foundation because years of silt had collected. Rainwater pressed against the north floor beams. Frozen snow would force the basalt outward. He dredged the trench 14 inches deep and carried the runoff toward a gravel pocket 27 feet away. Small stones became a filter. Woven willow branches held loose soil. Clay mixed with dry grass sealed low gaps. Old boards formed a temporary water trough. Only then did Zeb brace the roof with 2 lodgepole posts and patch the opening with planks, bark, clay, and sod. Maeve Danner, an elderly neighbor who had known Ephraim for decades, arrived with her granddaughter Nell, carrying warm cornbread. Maeve watched the new ditch filling during a brief afternoon shower. "Ephraim used to sit here for hours," she said. "He always claimed he could hear the ground breathe." Nell asked why the ditch mattered more than the leaking roof. "The roof gets one man wet," Zeb answered. "A failing foundation takes the whole cabin." Maeve looked quietly at Ephraim's survey rod and said nothing. The shower drained cleanly away, leaving foundation dry for the first time. 3 days later, hoofbeats echoed across the frozen ground. Hollis arrived with Owen Pike, the ranch foreman. He studied the cleaned drainage ditch, the patched roof, and the fresh lodgepole braces before shaking his head. "You're rescuing a wooden coffin." Then his smile returned. "I'll give you $300 silver. Keep your mule. I'll even put you on the survey crew for the timber road. The only condition was simple. Sign the deed over to Brackett Land Company." Hollis pointed toward the hillside. Black Fir Timber Syndicate wanted a wagon route across that slope. The old water trough no longer mattered, he claimed. Those 2.3 acres stood in the way of progress. Zeb looked at him. "If it's worthless, why offer $300? Hollis's patience disappeared. "The county inspector will condemn this place before winter. When they charge demolition costs, you'll wish you'd sold." Owen said nothing. His eyes drifted toward the new drainage ditch. Water flowed away from the basalt foundation instead of collecting against it. He noticed. So did Zeb. "I've slept beneath the ranch roof before," Zeb said quietly, "back when it was home." He looked toward the distant buildings. "I won't return as a hired man asking permission." The first hard freeze settled over Black Alder Basin before dawn. The temperature fell to nearly 8 degrees. North wind turned the damp sod roof into frozen stone. Because the chimney remained cracked, Zeb kept only a small fire alive through the night. Morning revealed something strange. Thin white frost covered nearly every floorboard inside the cabin. Nearly. A rectangle beside the pantry, roughly 3 feet by 4, held no frost at all. Zeb refused to guess. He checked for buried ashes. Nothing. He searched for another chimney. None. Sunlight had not touched the corner. The wood there was actually drier than the surrounding floor. He tied a loose thread near one narrow crack. Although every window and the door remained shut, the thread moved almost invisibly. Next came a candle. Its flame leaned toward the crack, straightened, then leaned again in a slow rhythm. In that exact moment, an old piece of advice suddenly flashed across his mind. Ephraim had once said, "Watch where the frost refuses to stay." At the time, the words sounded like fever talk. Now they sounded like instructions. Zeb knelt beside the pantry. His hand rested on the unfrosted boards. They felt cold, but not as cold as the floor around them. He whispered into the silent cabin, "What did you leave beneath this place?" Then he reached for the old flour bin and began taking it apart. Zeb pulled the old flour bin away from the pantry wall. Beneath years of dust and mouse droppings lay 4 floorboards whose seams were far too even to belong to the rest of the cabin. He slipped a pry bar beneath the first plank. Below it rested a thick oak frame, reinforced with hand-forged iron straps. This was no ordinary root cellar. The hatch carried hidden hinges, a forged iron pull ring, and a brass lock stained green with age. Pressed into the lock face were 3 tiny punch marks arranged in a triangle. Zeb stared at them. The pattern matched 3 small chisel marks carved into Ephraim's old survey rod. He first tried the cabin key. It did not fit. He unscrewed the brass cap from the survey rod, expecting another compartment. Nothing. Yet the lower end still felt heavier than solid wood should. Turning the brass measuring collar a full rotation, he felt something release. The rod separated into 2 pieces. Inside rested a slender key wrapped in oilcloth that had kept rust away for years. At last, the fragments of the past clicked perfectly into place. During Ephraim's final week, his weakened hand had pushed that survey rod toward Zeb across the bed. Zeb had believed the old man simply wanted it moved. Now he understood. The key slid perfectly into the lock. It refused to turn. Cold had tightened the brass, and pressure held the mechanism from below. Zeb forced nothing. He brushed away rust, worked fresh grease into the keyway, warmed the brass slowly beside the stove, and waited until the metal expanded evenly. Only then did he try again. The lock answered with a heavy click that echoed beneath the cabin. Using the pry bar and a length of timber for leverage, Zeb lifted the hatch. Cold, damp air rolled upward. His grease lamp flickered violently. Stone steps disappeared into darkness. The 5th step lay beneath standing water. The air carried the smell of wet earth and old timber. White fungus clung to one support beam. The lamp revealed barely 16 feet before the passage bent out of sight. Somewhere beyond the turn, water dripped with steady rhythm. Zeb lowered the lamp on a rope. The flame weakened. Then it nearly died. He pulled it back immediately. The air below was not safe. Curiosity could wait. He lowered the hatch again, opened every cabin door and window, then walked the hillside searching for another path the tunnel might breathe through. Lighting a bundle of damp grass, he carried the drifting smoke across the slope. Most of it rose into the wind. One thin stream suddenly bent downward and vanished beneath tangled brush more than 30 feet from the cabin. There, hidden beneath roots and an abandoned mouse nest, Zeb uncovered the broken mouth of a clay ventilation pipe. He cleared it carefully, a handful of soil at a time, refusing to collapse the passage beneath. Minutes later, the airflow changed. Cool air no longer pressed upward against the hatch. Evening arrived before the tunnel welcomed anyone inside. Instead of lifting the hatch again, Zeb repaired the shelter over moss before darkness settled across the basin. The following morning, Zeb tested the tunnel again. He lowered a grease lamp down the stone stairway. This time the flame remained steady. It proved only that the air had improved. Nothing more. He tied a safety rope around one of the cabin's roof braces before gathering a second lamp, wax-wrapped matches, a short pry bar, a carpenter's hammer, wooden wedges, a coil of flax rope, and a damp cloth to cover his mouth if dust became too heavy. The stairway descended into a passage built from fieldstone and old fired brick. Its arched ceiling measured little more than 6 feet 2 inches high and less than 4 feet across. Cold water covered his boots to the ankles near the entrance. Zeb paused. The seepage no longer flowed strongly. He recognized why. The flooded section matched the clogged drainage ditch he had reopened outside the cabin. Water had been pressing downward through years of neglected soil. Since the ditch was restored, the leakage had already begun to lessen. Nearly 40 feet inside, he stopped again. A cracked section of ceiling sagged overhead. One timber support had rotted through at its base and bent beneath the weight of the hillside. Without hesitation, Zeb unpacked the lodgepole braces he had prepared before entering. He wedged a temporary frame beneath the failing beam, tapping each support until the load settled evenly across both sides. The timber groaned once, then became still. Only after the weight had shifted did he crawl beneath it. The tunnel soon divided. One branch sloped lower toward the sound of running water. The other angled quietly toward the ranch house. 3 chisel marks formed a small triangle on the stone wall between them. Zeb chose the lower passage without hesitation. A tunnel could never be trusted until its water was understood. The narrow corridor ended inside a low stone chamber, where Alder Spring emerged through a hand-cut channel worn smooth by decades of flowing water. The system revealed itself one section at a time. Spring water entered a small settling basin where sand and gravel dropped to the bottom. From there it crossed a narrow overflow weir. A clay pipe carried the main flow toward the ranch. A smaller branch disappeared in the direction of the cabin. The design was simple. It was also remarkably efficient. Zeb knelt beside the main outlet. Mineral deposits and invading roots had narrowed the clay pipe to barely half its original opening. The water system had not failed. It had simply been abandoned. Dark ink marks covered one wall. Each line recorded winter water levels from earlier years. The highest mark bore the date 1879, the year Black Alder Basin endured one of its harshest freezes. Ephraim had preserved the spring beneath stone because groundwater remained far warmer and more stable than the freezing air above. Protected below the frost line, the source continued flowing even through severe winters. Zeb cleared a blocked overflow channel first, allowing excess water to escape harmlessly away from the chamber instead of forcing pressure back toward the foundation. He resisted opening the ranch supply pipe completely. Too much water too quickly would carry years of mud and mineral deposits deeper into the old line. Patience would save the system. Inside a small niche carved into the wall, his lamp revealed a brass plate no larger than his hand. 4 words had been neatly engraved: water first, papers second. Zeb smiled faintly. He filled Ephraim's old tin cup from the spring, took one quiet drink, then rested the cup beneath the flowing water exactly where his grandfather had always placed it during every inspection. No explanation was needed. The ritual itself carried the memory forward. Zeb returned to the junction and chose the passage leading toward the ranch. Nearly 100 yards ahead, the tunnel ended beneath a partially collapsed brick arch. Broken masonry, packed earth, and pine roots had nearly sealed the corridor. Only a narrow opening near the top still carried fresh air. He refused to dig through the center. Removing the wrong stones would pull the hillside down with them. Instead, Zeb built 2 timber support frames, one behind the other. He fastened rough planks across the opening to catch loose debris, removed earth one thin layer at a time, and drove wooden wedges beneath bricks still carrying weight. Rather than force a path through the middle, he carved a narrow passage along one side. The work consumed 2 full days. Nell Danner arrived each afternoon with bread, dried meat, and fresh water. She quietly helped coil rope while Zeb reset his braces. When he showed Maeve the 3 triangular chisel marks sketched on a scrap of paper, she studied them for a long moment. Ephraim called those the 3 breaths, she said softly. The cabin, the spring chamber, the stone store. Late on the 2nd evening, Zeb finally uncovered the face of a heavy oak door wrapped in forged iron. Its locking mechanism stood on the tunnel side, not the ranch side. Only someone entering from the cabin could ever open it. Zeb leaned against the timber frame he had built himself and closed his eyes for one exhausted moment before reaching for the handle. The iron latch lifted without resistance. Beyond the door waited no treasure chamber. Instead, Zeb stepped into a carefully planned record room built to survive generations. Wooden shelves stood above the stone floor on raised supports. Tin cases protected rolled survey maps. Leather tubes held property deeds. 2 small iron chests rested beneath a workbench covered with dividers, compasses, measuring scales, and drafting tools worn smooth through decades of use. Canvas sacks contained thick account ledgers. Everything had been arranged for work, not display. A single envelope rested in the center of the table. For Zebulon, if he kept the water moving, he unfolded the letter. Ephraim's handwriting remained steady. Cordelia and Hollis, it said, would see only the ranch house, the cattle, and land that could be sold. They had never understood what truly sustained Black Alder Basin. Water, correct boundaries, and never taking more from the land than it could return. Over many years, Ephraim had quietly reunited rights that others had allowed to scatter. 6,400 acres of grazing land, the legal water rights to Alder Spring, limited timber rights, a narrow copper and silver mineral strip, 22 small gold bars reserved for emergencies. Every one of them had been legally tied to the deed of Alder Watch Cabin, with duplicate records secured in Cinder Creek by Marlowe Keene, the attorney and trusted record-keeper who had quietly safeguarded Ephraim's legal records for years. The final lines were shorter. The house carries the debt. The cabin carries the ground. Zeb opened one iron chest, just long enough to see the neatly stacked gold. Then he closed it again. Instead, he spread Ephraim's hand-drawn spring map across the table and gently smoothed its worn edges with both hands. In that quiet room, the paper felt heavier than the gold. When Zeb climbed back into the daylight, Owen Pike stood waiting beside Moss. The ranch foreman removed his hat before speaking. Hollis signed the final agreement with Black Fir Timber Syndicate yesterday. Snow clouds gathered over the western ridge. The road has to be opened before winter buries the pass. Owen handed Zeb a folded county notice. The temporary order declared Alder Watch Cabin unsafe because of its collapsed roof, cracked chimney, and an unregistered underground chamber. It also questioned whether Zeb occupied land that properly belonged to the ranch. "I thought you should see it first," Owen said quietly. The following morning, Hollis arrived with 2 freight wagons carrying laborers, logging chains, hand drills, and a wooden crate of black powder. He climbed down smiling. "My last offer. 500 silver dollars. A ticket out of Montana. Walk away." Zeb shook his head. Hollis pointed toward the basalt foundation. "We pull the cabin down. Drill the rock. Blast the hillside. The road goes through." Zeb understood the danger immediately. A careless charge could collapse the tunnel beneath the cabin. Worse, it could divert Alder Spring forever. He stepped in front of the work crew without reaching for a weapon. Instead, he unfolded the deed. "The first man who drives a drill into this foundation," Zeb said evenly, "will answer to the sheriff before he answers to your company." Silence settled across the hillside. Hollis kicked one of the basalt stones. Dead rock. Zeb never looked away. "Rock doesn't die," he replied. "It simply remembers consequences longer than people do." Hollis climbed back onto his horse. "You have until sunrise." Zeb packed only what mattered. The cabin deed, Ephraim's survey map, the handwritten letter, 1 original water rights certificate, 2 small gold bars for proof and expenses, Marlowe Keene's calling card. Snow thickened before he left Black Alder Basin. Cinder Creek lay nearly 30 miles away. By the second mile, fresh snow had erased the wagon ruts. North wind swept across open ridges, hiding every landmark beneath drifting white. Moss slipped once, then again on a sheet of hidden ice. Zeb slowed immediately. Speed would only break the mule's footing. He stopped to chip frozen ice from Moss's hooves, wrapped burlap around them for better grip, and kept to the lower draws where the hills broke the wind. More than once, he planted Ephraim's old survey rod into the snow to judge direction after the roadside markers disappeared completely. The storm grew heavier. Darkness arrived before the town lights. At last, a single oil lamp glowed through the window of Marlowe Keene's office. The attorney looked first at the survey rod, not the gold. A quiet smile crossed his face. Ephraim always said the right man would carry that before he carried the gold. Zeb laid the spring map upon the desk before reaching into his saddlebag. Only afterward did he place the 2 gold bars beside it. Marlowe nodded once. Without another question, he unlocked a sealed records cabinet that had remained unopened for 6 years. Marlowe spread the records across the desk, one document at a time. Years earlier, Ephraim had mortgaged the ranch house, the main barn, the registered cattle, the freight equipment, and the spring cattle contracts. The borrowed money had never been wasted. It had quietly reunited rights that others had sold away piece by piece. Water rights, grazing claims, limited mineral interests. Every one of them had been transferred into a separate holding attached legally to Alderwatch Cabin. 6 months before his death, Ephraim stopped making loan payments after Cordelia and Hollis pressured him to sign authority for future land sales. The extension had now expired. Cattle Bank of Helena stood ready to seize the ranch house and livestock. Cordelia and Hollis had inherited the visible property. They had also inherited every obligation secured against it. Marlowe folded his hands. "You are the sole beneficiary of Alderground Trust." Then he spoke more quietly. "The trust owns the land. It does not automatically save the people working on it. It cannot feed cattle through winter, and it cannot decide whether mercy is worth more than revenge." He prepared an emergency petition asking the territorial judge to halt demolition of the cabin until ownership could be reviewed. Before signing it, Marlowe looked across the desk. "You could let the bank take everything." Zeb lowered his eyes to the payroll list. "How many children," he asked, "live in the homes south of the main barn?" Before Zeb and Marlowe could return to Alderwatch Cabin, the weather changed without warning. A brief warm wind swept across Black Alder Basin, melting snow from the ranch roofs. Then the temperature crashed, below zero within hours. The ranch's shallow water lines froze solid. One supply pipe burst. Livestock troughs emptied. More than 300 cattle crowded around dry basins, bawling into the bitter wind. Owen Pike organized men with picks and shovels. The ground had already turned to stone. Nothing moved. As soon as he set foot back at Alderwatch Cabin, Zeb hurried underground. Inside the spring chamber, Alder Spring still flowed. The source lay deep beneath the frost line. Stone walls held the earth's steady warmth. The overflow channel remained open. Most importantly, the water never stood still. Zeb opened the smaller branch leading toward the cabin. Cold, clear water answered immediately. Hollis protested as Owen began driving cattle across Zeb's land. "That spring belongs to the ranch." "No," Owen replied, never slowing. "Today it belongs to the cattle." Zeb instructed Owen to divide the herd into smaller groups, so the banks would not collapse beneath hundreds of hooves. Maeve and Nell packed sandbags along the drainage edges, protecting the newly restored channels from being trampled apart. One line of cattle drank, then another. The panic slowly disappeared. No speech convinced the basin. No argument settled the question. Flowing water did. Nell looked toward Zeb. "Why save Hollis's cattle?" Zeb watched the exhausted animals lowering their heads to drink. They never read the will. The bitter night passed in rare peace. But human stubbornness is not as easily soothed as a herd of cattle. Morning light spread across the basin beneath a clear, bitter sky. Sheriff Tobias Wren arrived with Hollis, Cordelia, the demolition crew, and the county order. Marlowe Keene stood quietly beside Zeb on the cabin porch. Hollis demanded immediate removal of the trespasser and permission to drill the basalt foundation. Instead, Marlowe unfolded document after document. The territorial court's emergency stay, the independent deed for the 3-acre parcel, the original Alder Spring water rights, the Alder Ground Trust records, the survey marking the 3 stone monuments. Finally, the foreclosure notice issued by Cattle Bank of Helena. Sheriff Wren read each page carefully, then he folded them together. "This cabin is not part of the ranch holding," he announced. The demolition order was issued under false assumptions. Silence followed. Marlowe calmly explained that the ranch house, cattle, barns, and contracts carried every outstanding debt. Hollis stared at Zeb. "Where's the real inheritance?" Zeb opened his hand. $3 silver rested in his palm. "It's where you never thought worth entering." He said nothing more. The tunnel remained its own secret. Zeb then made one final decision. The trust would purchase the ranch debt. The workers would keep their jobs. The water rights would never be sold. Black Fir Timber Syndicate would lose every claim across Alderwatch Cabin. Sheriff Wren turned toward the laborers. "Pack your tools." No one laughed this time. 2 years later, Alderwatch Cabin stood again. Its lodgepole walls had been rebuilt with reclaimed timber. Clay mixed with dry grass sealed the joints. The basalt foundation had been reset stone by stone. A sod roof followed the correct drainage slope, and the rebuilt stone chimney matched the original proportions that Ephraim had trusted for decades. The cabin no longer looked abandoned. It looked useful. Zeb never turned Black Alder into a private estate. Families received long-term grazing leases instead of uncertain agreements renewed every season. Alder Spring remained protected under shared water use. Logging on the northern slope stayed tightly limited. The old stone store became a place for seed grain, survey maps, winter supplies, and shelter whenever blizzards closed the basin. Part of the tunnel remained sealed, not to hide wealth, to protect the spring. Cordelia eventually left Montana. Hollis spent years paying the personal obligations created by the contracts he had signed in pursuit of quick profit. Owen Pike managed the ranch under the new trust. Maeve tended the medicinal garden beside the cabin. Nell learned to read land with Ephraim's old survey rod. Inside the cabin, 3 silver dollars rested beneath glass beside the worn pry bar and Ephraim's dented tin cup. Water still flowed quietly beneath the floor. The greatest inheritance beneath Black Alder had never been gold hidden underground. It was the judgment to know where water should travel, where weight should rest, and whom an inheritance should continue serving. One autumn afternoon, Nell aligned Ephraim's survey rod between the 3 stone markers. The line settled true. Zeb answered with nothing more than a single nod. It was the same quiet approval Ephraim had once given him,